We have a big movie to talk about today, Tony.
Big in every sense of the word, yes.
I wasn't really sure, as much as I've grown up on this movie, and I know that you've only seen it recently. I actually wasn't sure how to even encapsulate this in 90 minutes for people, because while the plot is very straightforward, the movie is one of those films from before we had to have an explosion every 20 seconds.
Yeah.
So you have a story that actually takes time to show real human beings boil, in their interpersonal conflicts and whatever their challenges are. They give it time to breathe. But there's all these key moments that happen. The movie's not boring, but how do you express to an audience that slow boiling point in 90 minutes? Welcome to War Stories, everyone, where we're talking about Bridge on the River Kwai, directed by David Lean. Tony, I just got to ask before we actually get started talking about the plot. I know you'd heard about this film for a long time, and you've been to the actual bridge this movie inspired. Originally a book, fictionalized history yarn that this bridge inspired. What did you know about this film as a film before you actually saw it? Like, was it,
Well, much like films like Lawrence of Arabia, I had heard a hell of a lot about, people throw around the word classic. They talk about Alec Guinness's performance. My grandfather on my dad's side, he was a medic in World War II. He served in Burma, and he treated a lot of people who came off the death railway. I remember when I was very young, there was like some scuttlebutt in my family about, don't ever have that film on TV if Granddad's coming around, because if he catches a glimpse of it, he'll get very, very upset. And it's a film that I've always wanted to watch. So as we were going through this series of war stories, I was like, hey, this would be a great next film to discuss. So I sat down. Obviously, we've kind of missed a couple of scheduled Fridays due to me moving house, etc. So I watched it about 5 weeks ago, and then I watched it again last night. And the movie wasn't quite what I was expecting. I knew kind of the whole story about the prisoners of war and the bridge, but then there's all those, which I'm sure we'll get into later, but then there's all those other scenes about, is it William Holden?
Yes.
His escape and all of that stuff, because nothing like that's shown in the trailer or anything. And I was really taken aback, because the film was not what I was expecting. And it certainly didn't feel like a 2.5 hour film it felt like a 90-minute film, but I was so engrossed in the characters and what was going on. So
it's an expertly paced movie for anybody who still likes a properly developed story. And I don't mean to sound like a snob when I say that. There are films that are way too long and boring. Eternals. There are films that kind of go up their own rear end. Even back when, there are films that tried to be an epic and just failed. I mean, Khartoum is one of them. It's trying to tell a really interesting story, but it's also chasing David Lean. And he was really good at movies like Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia. That's why he's still remembered today. I think I have more clips for this particular movie. This episode of War Stories, everyone, is definitely getting flagged or demonetized before this stream is over. And like Flyboys, I will have to download it and re-upload it most likely. But I did try to edit through some things. Let's just quickly get through some super chats, then we'll get on to the plot here. Matt Movie 611, excited for this episode, as this is one of my favorite war films and just favorite films in general. Alec gives the definition of a deserved Oscar-winning performance in this. Totally agree. Our buddy Salvador, thank you for being here. He said, I have a night off, a meatball sub, and two of my favorite handsome men gracing my TV screen. It's a good life. Yeah, you'll notice that Tony Roberts is a appropriately saturated human being, and I am what Tony would look like if you take Photoshop and desaturate down all the way. Brian Dillingham, thanks for the whoa. That's a lot bigger than a Dillinghamism, but thank you so much, sir. Off topic. This is for a fantastic indie toy video. You're very welcome. And Tony and I had a lot of fun making that. That was a fun one to make. Chazilla, thank you for the very kind super chat. He says, always love Bridge on the River Kwai. I watch it a few times a year. Reminds me of watching Saturday afternoons with my dad and grandfather. Great acting, great cast, great story, and only one big explosion, unlike today's films. You build to it. You build to it. I didn't do any... In the doing of the research I'm about to tell you, I wasn't, like you and I talked about, War Stories as a series is not as much a historian's nitpickers thing. We've always talked about overt changes to things when they're relevant, but we're not out to like pull a movie apart in every episode. We're out to talk about the merits of the film itself, like you've said many times. So what I wanted to do was just get some questions answered for myself about basic things, about the filming of it, you know, the filming of the bridge they made in Sri Lanka, the filming of the train, things like that. And in the process, I ended up learning some other information about the filming of this movie that I feel really needs to be made clear at the beginning before we jump into the plot. So the brief version is this. The film was originally a book, and it was a book by a French author named Pierre Boulle or Boulle. It's Boulle. Sacre Boule. Anyway, so
is that the same guy who wrote Planet of the Apes?
Good question. I don't know that off the top of my head, but we should check.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. That's a War Stories we'll get to one day, maybe, if we can shoehorn that in somewhere. That'd be awesome. War Stories, and we're just talking about Planet of the Apes, and we just pretend the whole time that we think it's real, and everybody is like, So anyway, I found out that the author, who is French, was a POW in Thailand in World War II. Now, this is where it gets interesting and dovetails into the production of the film. I know that Alec Guinness and a few of the other British actors in the pre-production of the movie, before they were actually filming and had cast everything, some of them were reticent to take on the roles because they felt that the script, based on the book, showed the British in a negative light. Now, we all know David Lean is a British director, so there's that. But some of the actors were very concerned. And I've often wondered that myself, because even though the bridge in Thailand was made by a real British Army contingent in World War II, the personalities of all the characters and the main thrust of the plot around Nicholson, played by Alec Guinness, could be interpreted as a kind of unflattering portrayal of a British officer, right? Well, what I found out that I know I'm going to start with this and we're going to lose half the viewers just by me saying it. I found out that this Pierre Boulle author, he used the actual British Army building of the bridge, the POWs of that, as his setting. But he based Captain Nicholson on French officers in the POW camp that he was in who collaborated with the enemy. Wow. So, yeah. So I don't know if he was too humiliated to actually make the characters French, or if he found the bridge setting too compelling to ignore and knew that those were British POWs, and just decided, but my experience as a POW's got to come into play, so I'm just going to make this guy this way. Either way, a pretty damning testimony on the author himself. But I was relieved because it meant that what we're actually seeing is a true historical fiction. So for everybody who's about to see the plot unfold, remember, start with this. We are seeing a setting that is historically inspired by British POWs on the Kwai River. But we are seeing main characters that are actually pastiches of French POWs. And that is something that cannot be overemphasized. All right, so now we're going to move forward. All right.
So the chat has told me that I was correct in that author did write Planet of the Apes. So much in the same way that in that story, the apes become the humans. In this story, he swapped the British and the French. So,
wow. You can't make this stuff up. Nick Cage, he says, thank you for the super chat. He says, this is my favorite Star Wars prequel. Hello there. All right, so let's get started with the plot. Tony, kick us off.
Well, the film opens with some, as you would expect from a David Lean production, with some stunning cinematography. And so we have a contingent of British POWs in Thailand. Obviously, they've been captured. That's why they're POWs. And it starts off with a large contingent of them, almost like a company-sized contingent of British soldiers who are marched into this Japanese work camp. And I always knew that the Colonel Bogey was very closely connected to the bridge on the River Kwai. For some reason in my head, I thought it was something that was going to come up like, in the third act of the film. And it's at the start.
Yeah.
I did mention before we started, I said, if the chat please chat, don't start whistling. We might get demonetized.
I'm actually going to risk, there's a little bit of a clip I've got that I'm going to risk playing. It's very brief, but I'm hoping it gets past the censors. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. So the British troops, they march into the POW camp, obviously whistling Colonel Bogey, and then the officers are basically, the British officers are then greeted. They have their first interaction with the Japanese commander of the camp and some of the other Japanese officers. And there's also the scene with William Holden, who is burying a lot of dead POWs, and he's kind of speaking to the guard, and he's doing his little sort of scam thing. He wants to stay on the sick. He wants to be in the hospital. Doesn't want to be out working on the bridge and so forth. But see, as the film progresses, it's all about these British soldiers. They know they're POWs. They know they have to build this bridge, but they still want to be able to retain the kind of rights and standards that the British would have, which mainly consists around the officers not working but directing the men. And this presents the real core of the initial confrontation between the British and the Japanese.
Yeah, the first half of the movie, of a 2.5 hour, 2 hour, 40-minute experience, is that question of who wins the staring contest between the Japanese POW not commandants, that's a German word, but the people running the Japanese POW camp and the POW officers who are fighting for the Geneva Convention tenets. And the second half of the movie has more to do with the actual building of the bridge, and we'll see more about that in a second. Now, I have some clips here that you've just described, so we can show the audience a little bit of this. So the first bit that I have here is meeting Shears, because as Shears, played by William Holden, is introduced, you are just seeing the British contingent showing up on the hillside, and he is burying. He's just, as Tony said, he has just bribed a guard with a cigarette lighter to stay on the sick list in the hospital, because every single American and many other nationalities of soldiers that he went into that camp with are all dead. Like, they've all died of different things like diseases and, tropical maladies and overwork and underfed. So here's this little bit where he and a British soldier are burying one of the latest casualties.
Weaver, I've forgotten who we just buried.
Thompson.
Oh, yes. Here lies Corporal Herbert Thompson, serial number 01234567.
I mean, they've gotten to the point where they don't even, mentally, it's like we've lost count. Like we don't even, there are no relationships anymore. It's just, am I still breathing today? Great. How do I keep breathing today? Like whatever I have to do. And then as he has successfully bartered to stay on the sick list, that's when the British contingent of Captain Nicholson shows up. And you're seeing that through the hospital. David Lean actually shoots that through the hospital. So you're seeing all these guys that are laid up with all kinds of problems, watching these people being marched in like, by the numbers. And it's kind of a weird thing because you're going, do they not realize they're walking into a hellscape? And there's the implication that they've already been POWs elsewhere. But they've been moved to this location. So they have to know on some level. And what you find out is that the reason that they're still marching to orders and everything and by the numbers is because of Nicholson, Colonel Nicholson. I'm sorry, is it Captain Nicholson or Colonel Nicholson?
No, Colonel. Yeah,
Colonel Nicholson. I think I've said Captain a few times. Sorry, everyone. I know the difference between Belgium and Holland. Okay. But anyway, so they come in, and as Tony said, they are introduced to Colonel Saito, who is the head of the Japanese contingent in the camp. He's basically the camp commandant, and he's not. He doesn't dance around why they're there.
If you work hard, you will be treated well. But if you do not work hard, you will be punished.
He wants the officers to work alongside the men because he has been tasked by the Japanese army with building a bridge across the River Kwai to link Rangoon to, I don't remember if it's Burma or Bangkok or something like that. And everybody, all these different POW groups have been set up along this railway to try and get it set up and completed by a certain date. And so he's like, everybody's going to work. Everybody. And that's when Nicholson tries to be diplomatic. And it goes something like this.
The use of officers for manual labor is expressly forbidden by the Geneva Convention.
Is that so?
I happen to have a copy of the convention with me and would be glad to let you glance through it if you wish.
What happens next? Well, go ahead, Tony. You're happy to go ahead. Go right ahead.
First of all, I'm trying to remember exactly what he does. He certainly doesn't need a copy of the Geneva Convention.
No, as a matter of fact, he just looks at him and he's like, "That will not be necessary." And then he just walks off into his quarters. And Nicholson is kind of like, "Oh, wow, cool! Like we've had the conversation. He seems to understand. I'm gonna go check on the people in the hospital who I'm gonna go meet." Scuba Pete, thank you for the super chat. He says, I love Harrison Ford in this one. Blow up that bridge before the Nazis. Whoops, wrong bridge. Wrong bridge. You're thinking of Force 10 from Navarone, which we will also get to at some point. So they, let's see. Okay. I've got all my clips numbered, by the way. I've learned to do this since the first War Stories. I've actually gotten pretty good with this. So he goes into the hospital. He's kind of getting to know the lay of the land. And his medical officer is also getting set up in the hospital as well, and also checking on everybody. And William Holden is there, Shears, and he's just having a shave because he's just gotten back on the sick list thanks to bribing this guard. And he and Nicholson start having a conversation because Nicholson's asking him how he got there because he's the only American in the camp. And then he asks about the causes of mortality, the high mortality amongst the troops. And this is what Shears says.
Of malaria, dysentery, beriberi, gangrene. Other causes of death, famine, overwork, bullet wounds, snake bites. Saito.
I mean, he's trying to get him to understand that there's nothing, there's no reprieve here. Like,
Yeah.
you know, and this is where there's that moment where the doctor asks William Holden to sit up on the makeshift exam table so that he can check him out, make sure he's all right generally. And that's when Nicholson says, I had a conversation with Saito and he seems like a very reasonable man. And I think he's fine. And he wanders off and William Holden laughs on the exam table. And the doctor is like, what? And he's like, nothing. And he's like, no, tell me. And he's like, I'd call Saito a lot of things, but reasonable is not one of them. Like,
yeah,
you know, that character of the doctor, for everybody watching, he's going to become pivotal later. He actually quite soon. And he's a mainstay throughout the film. Tony, at this point, I'm going to show a clip and then I'm going to have some questions to ask you, because now that we've established who the writer of this was, what some of the what some of the choices were in the script. I've got some questions after this next clip, but to give everybody the kind of setup, we didn't have this clip to show because a lot of this stuff is fairly drawn out, and YouTube being what it is. When they meet Saito, when they walk in, he tells everybody that there is no barbed wire. It's very much the scene in Star Trek VI is inspired directly from this film where the Klingon is telling Kirk and McCoy and everybody on the ice planet that there's no stockade. If you guys remember that movie out there, it was inspired by this film. He says there is no barbed wire, there is no stockade, there is no guard towers. He's like, we are in the middle of nowhere. We are in the jungle. And if you decide that you want to try and hoof it and leave, that's up to you. Like, you will die. He says, that's the quote. He's like, you would die if you leave this camp the way you are. He's not totally wrong, but at the same time, a kind of soldier's obligation moral question comes up. So let me play this clip for everybody, because this is where Nicholson and his officers have their first meeting, and they bring Shears to the meeting because he's been there the longest and they need some of his input. And one of the British officers asks about setting up the escape committee, just like they do in The Great Escape, just like they do in Colditz, just like they do in all of these prison camps during World War II. And this is Nicholson's response.
About the escape committee, sir. I've had a talk with Commander Shears.
There won't be any escape committee. That fellow Saito is right. No need for barbed wire here. 1 chance in 100 of survival.
Tony, if you were sitting in as a experienced combat soldier, if you were in a meeting like that and found yourself a POW and you were set up and ready, you know, to form that escape committee and start planning, you know, breakouts and things like that, and your commanding officer said that to you, like, what would your thought be in that moment?
That he's gone mad.
Really?
Yeah. I've been trained in jungle warfare. I actually I went to the jungle warfare school in Brunei, which is a very similar part of the world, and
yeah,
we had to live and operate in a dense jungle for 28 days straight, and I was very well equipped for that. It's recognized as the most challenging part of Special Forces selection, you know, to survive the 28 days in the jungle.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is very, very. The jungle is a very dangerous environment. It's full of disease and insects and things that want to. But I came back with a number of medical conditions from 28 days in the jungle.
Right.
But in my mind, I would still rather tackle that than Japanese torture.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
also,
I know.
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and also it's understood that especially for officers, it's expected that you will try to escape, especially in World War II. That was very much the standard, to harass the enemy to the best of their ability outside, behind enemy lines, to have them have to use an inordinate amount of troops to track you down, and that can't be then deployed to the front lines. But his rationale is, I'm just going to take Saito's word for it, and then this is where they push back on him a little bit. And this is where his mental gymnastics take a turn that even as a kid, when I saw this for the first time, I was like, biscuit? Like that? Huh? Like
you do that dog thing where you go,
yeah, wait, what? Like his mental cartwheel here is impressive.
In Singapore, we were ordered to surrender by command headquarters. Ordered, mind you. Therefore, in our case, escape might well be an infraction of military law.
I mean, I think what blows me away about it is you want to look at the guy and go, you should have been a lawyer, because as much as that messes with my head, it's messing with my head more because somehow you backflipped into logic that I think is ludicrous, yet can't quite discount. Like it's something where I'm like, because anybody who's read World War II history knows about the British surrender in Singapore. It was one of the most shocking developments, because the commanding officer at that time, the general, I can't remember his name, he kind of was acting of his own volition, and the rest of the British troops around the world were all shocked that he did that. I mean, he never quite recovered his reputation from that move. Like, it was a big deal even in the history books, because it really wasn't in keeping with the British way of doing things. And that's how so many British guys got captured. Now, I just want to say once again, everybody, keep this in mind. The writer of this movie was basing Colonel Nicholson on multiple French officers in his own Japanese POW camp. So while he is creating a British setting here, which is historically based, Nicholson is not reflective of who the real man was. And they actually wrote a biography about him called The Man Behind the Bridge, which I really want to read. It's about the real guy. So anyway, so yeah.
The interesting thing is, like, we've already established that this movie is a historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
With a large part of it centered around the conflict between Nicholson and Saito.
Right.
That doesn't happen if you can't establish Nicholson's point of view.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And as you said, when I'm watching that, when his first response is, "Nope, there will be no escapes," I'm like, I've heard this is a classic film. This is a great film, and it's almost broken. And then he comes out with that, and you're just like, whoa.
Mm-hmm.
A brilliant piece of writing, which without that, that explanation of the complicated situation following their surrender,
right?
Without him explaining it the way that, the whole movie falls apart.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And because that actually also has historical context in the mass surrender at Singapore, you have some kind of validity for how everybody was feeling after that order had been given. It was like, well, the war's over for us, I guess, and here we are. So if you combine that with what Saito said about the jungle, then yeah, it's not too huge a logic leap to get there. It's just more of a wow, like I didn't see that coming. Like this is a better kind of twist to me than anything M. Night Shyamalan has done. It's kind of like, because at first I'm like you, I'm like, this movie's broken, and then I'm like, this movie's I'll be quiet and just keep watching for a minute. And then Saito the next morning has corralled them all up. He's planning to take all of them, officers and enlisted men, en masse to the bridge site. to get to work on this bridge. And he says this to everybody.
Your officers will work beside you. This is only just. For it is they who betrayed you by surrender. Your shame is their dishonor.
So right after we have the scene where he gives us the mental gymnastics of, well, we were ordered to surrender, so if we start escaping, we could be in violation of our orders. And then he doubles down thematically on that by saying, you know, your officers betrayed you by surrendering the way they did. So, you know, their dishonor is your shame, you know, or you know, or your dishonor is their shame or something like that. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tony.
No, watching this film,
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost glad I waited until I was kind of 44 years of age to watch this, because, well, there's not a lot of films, both new and old, that kind of surprise me much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
This film did that multiple times. This
Right.
film surprised me. It got the gray matter. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it was sparking the whole way through. Just to digress real quickly, there's
Mm-hmm.
that brilliant line from Saito, which I can't remember if it's in this scene or in the previous scene, where he says to the British, "Be happy in your work."
Yes.
Like, they're on the death railway.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, when I got into YouTube, it was very much, you know, that old expression, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life.
Right.
6 years later, it's like, I love about 20% of it.
right? Yeah, you can only do the same thing for so long before even it starts to feel rote. Like, I think the only thing like that in my life where I've never really gotten tired of it for some reason is making peanut butter sandwiches. Other than that, I don't know why. Other than that, I can get tired of anything. Even people who are very focused and very determined, they can burn out.
I would have, the next time you're in the kitchen and you're making
Mm-hmm.
a peanut butter sandwich, and you're spreading that peanut butter, I just want you to look up at Melinda and go, "Be happy in your work."
Oh, that is a deal. I will do that. So Nicholson still hears Saito saying the officers are going to work too. And he's like, it's kind of like Captain Kirk in Star Trek V. A lot of Star Trek references tonight. In Star Trek V, where God is talking to them at the end, and he's like, "Excuse me, what does God need with a starship?" Colonel Nicholson practically pulls a, "Excuse me," and he walks up to remind him, I thought we had this conversation yesterday about the Geneva Convention, and officers don't do manual labor. And he pulls out his Geneva Convention handbook, and Saito doesn't respond well to that.
You see, the code specifically states that the...
Diverse in the ranks. What code? The coward's code.
William Holden tried to warn him. he didn't listen. But this is where I think anybody who hasn't seen this movie, this is where, like you and I said, the mental twists. It's a movie that, while the plot is very straightforward, the things that happen, the reversals, the interpersonal conflicts, they never quite go the way you think. And so while you're sitting here looking at this guy that you know from all the context clues is dangerous, and all of his POWs have previously died except for a handful, and he will work you to death if he's literally smacking the head British officer around and saying, I'm not going to listen to you and your dumb Geneva Convention. You are all going to get to work. And Nicholson doesn't budge. He's like, no. And so they send all the enlisted men off to work because they agree, enlisted men cannot refuse, POW work. Fine. And the rest of them are just standing there. And then Saito's like, if you don't get your officers to work in like 3 seconds, I'm going to machine gun all of them down. And I'll just play the clip.
I'll count 3. If by the third count, you and your officers are not on their way to work, I'll give the order to fire.
He's going to do it. Believe me, he's really going to do it.
I mean, Holden is still at the last minute, like, for the love of God, listen to me. This man is not to be messed with.
Yeah.
What do you think at this point, Tony, in the film? Because I don't think there's any, much like with Steve McQueen being in The Great Escape, this was a time where, because they knew they were selling films to the American market, they had to put a movie star in there somewhere. And this movie precedes The Great Escape by almost a decade. So you've got William Holden in there, probably for American star power in the American market, because I don't think there were any documented Americans at the bridge site for this context. But what do you think of his inclusion in the fiction of this story?
It works very, very well. I don't think it necessarily matters what nationality he is. He could have made him an Australian.
Right.
I think it does work very well that, you've got the one character who, as the story plays out, has obviously been in the camp longer. He knows what Saito's about. Making him a different nationality almost kind of makes that work a little bit better, because you then got, the way the British and the Americans do things slightly differently. Now this scene here where, the officers are refusing to go to work, and he brings the truck down, machine gun on a tripod there. I'm going to count to 3, and then we get introduced to the doctor. I don't know the actor's name.
I can't ever remember his name, but he was also the head commanding officer of the RAF in The Great Escape. He had the cane. He was the only guy higher than Richard Attenborough in that film, and he's been in a lot of movies, a lot of classic films. But I'm sorry, keep going. I just wanted to interject that.
No, yeah, I mean, he gives a terrific performance in this film. A really, really good performance. So they are literally, seconds away from being machine gunned down. William Holden's character wants them to see sense. This man is a dangerous man, and it's only due to, I suppose, the courage and bravery of the medical officer to go and challenge Saito, and say, you can't do this. Like, all these witnesses in the hospital are going to see this. A very interesting moment, which then obviously leads into them. It's a standoff at that point,
right?
And I think Saito, he goes back into his hut, which is I love how he's got that little guy always sitting outside his hut, pulling the rope up and down,
pulling the rope,
arm leaf inside to keep him cool. It's just a nice little detail. And then through some very very well done editing, you understand this immense passage of time that goes by where Saito's in his quarters and the British officers are just standing there looking down the barrel of a machine gun.
Yeah, and I have a brief little bit from this where, as they're standing out there in the heat of the day, like they're standing out there all day, I don't know if they're at parade rest or attention, but they're in one version or another. They're standing fast in their ranks, I'll put it that way, waiting to see what's going to happen. William Holden, the other guy who was helping him dig the grave, and the dude who was also advocating for the escape committee are all sitting in the hospital watching. And they're all going, the guy that William Holden dug the grave with is like, well, you've got to admit, Nicholson's got guts. And then suddenly William Holden just kind of loses it a little bit.
That kind of guts. Also the kind they had in 1914 when your officers went over the top with nothing but a swagger stick.
Yes, sir, I see what you mean.
You don't see what I mean at all. Kind of guts that can get us all killed.
He's looking at this and he's saying, there's in his mind, there's a way to make a point, and there's a time and place to make a point, and he does not think this is it. Yep. And in the moment, as the viewer, you're kind of with William Holden on that because you've seen what this guy's capable of. But again, this movie is not so cut and dry. The movie will. That's what I love about this movie is it tests my perceptions of everything from like every 10 minutes. It keeps testing my perceptions. So in the background of all this, the enlisted men are deliberately sabotaging, not in any violent way, but the enlisted men are not playing nice with the Japanese bridge builders, the Japanese bridge officers. They're letting things fall apart. They're not working very efficiently. They're doing what they feel is necessary to aid in the Allied war effort of preventing the Japanese from building this bridge while not completely refusing to work. And there's this little bitty moment here.
Let go!
It's going to escalate in a little bit, but this sets up the issue for Saito and his officers of, we've only got 2 months or something, or 3 months. We got 3 months, I think, to build this bridge at that point, and or 2 months, I can't remember. Time is a funny thing in this movie, and we've got to get this thing moving. The last thing we need are things falling apart, and meanwhile, they throw the officers and Nicholson into ovens, like not literal ovens, but they call it the oven. They throw them into these
the hot box.
the hot box. Yeah, they throw them into the hot box where they're in the heat of the jungle, tropical heat, under this corrugated metal enclosure. They're all just suffering like horribly.
Yeah,
and Saito calls the doctor a few days later to his quarters and implores him to convince Nicholson to make the officers work. And then says, if you don't convince him, I'm going to close the hospital. So go tell him that. And I have a little bit of the scene here where he's talking to the doctor.
Your officers will walk beside them.
As he pointed out, it's against the rules.
Do not speak to me of rules. This is war. This is not a game of cricket.
He's like, I don't think you're listening to me. I'm not. I don't care about the rules. So then he goes to the hot box and tries to talk some sense into Nicholson, who refuses, because as much as Nicholson's kind of out to lunch, he seems to have real resolve. Like you think the guy's out to lunch, and then you're like, but man, can he hold to a principle? Like the guy won't budge. And I love this little exchange here between the doctor and Nicholson, because the doctor is trying to convince Nicholson to make the officers work to save the people in the hospital and all that kind of stuff. And Nicholson won't budge. He says it's a matter of principle. And then he has this little remark.
A corporal should always know.
Whoops, sorry, wrong one. Here we go. I lost count. Here we go.
I just had a word with Saito. That man's the worst commanding officer I've ever come across. Actually, I think he's mad.
I think he's mad. Like he's assessing him up like it's no biggie. He's like, I'm here in this oven, but he's the crazy one, not me.
I think both of them are a little bit.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you think they're both kind of nuts at this point?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that little throwaway line there, I think he's mad, has a lot of layers to it.
Yeah.
Because almost apart really from the British medical officer and William Holden's character is Shears, yeah?
Yeah, Shears. Mm-hmm.
Look, they're the two sane ones, these side characters, and then the two main characters are quite mad. I think what's interesting, I really got the impression in the opening few scenes with William Holden's character, where he uses the lighter to bribe himself into the hospital, that he's quite content to almost keep bribing the Japanese to stay on the sick list and live out the war that way.
Right.
And now we're coming up to sort of following this, where he decides to make an escape attempt. It's Nicholson's behavior that drives him to escape.
Right.
He's like, I can't stay here now. Not with this. Not with these two guys at loggerheads.
Right.
Yeah.
These two guys are driving each other to loggerheads, and eventually the powder keg is going to go off. I got to get out of here. And the guy that wanted to set up the escape committee wants to go with him. And his buddy from the grave dig wants to go with him, I believe. And they're all going to make a break for it. But they make this break for it through the jungle. And I didn't pull any clips from this because it really is an escape through the jungle. I mean, if you guys have seen an escape in the jungle before, I'm not saying it's poorly shot or anything like that. But if I have to risk the copyright gods, I want to risk it on moments that can't just be explained in one sentence. So he's the only one that really makes it out of there. They think they've shot him when he falls off a cliff into a waterfall into a river. But he actually gets away. He's not actually wounded. He's okay. And he drags himself off until he's delirious with thirst and hunger. He finds himself in the company of some native villagers. They nurse him back to health. They give him a reed boat and they give him some provisions. He runs out of those provisions trying to get down the river. He gets sick again because he runs out of water. So he starts drinking the river water. And then at that point, you don't really know what happens to Shears for a little while. In the background, you've got Saitu desperate to get the bridge back on track. And the the enlisted men are working at a snail's pace. They're delightfully keeping things not moving.
Yeah.
And one night he brings Nicholson out of the oven into his quarters and tries to tempt him with British food. He's got British, I think, corned beef, and he's got British alcohol and things like that.
A bottle of scotch or something.
Yeah. And he's trying to butter him up and say, look, we can be friends. If you just get those officers to work, this could all be over. And Nicholson once again is like, nah, sorry. Even though he's like drawn and, emaciated and just in a horrible state, he's like, nope, I won't do this. And so then Saitu says to him, I've only got 2 months to get this bridge built. I'm supposed to be here, and I'm only here. And then this moment happens.
Do you know what will happen to me if the bridge is not ready in time?
I haven't the foggiest.
I'll have to kill myself. What would you do if you are me?
I suppose if I were you, I'd have to kill myself. Cheers.
Which has to be one of the best moments in the whole film. There's a lot of great moments in this film, but this is one of the highlights. I mean, that right there is where I feel like somebody said, you know what? We actually kind of need to let some of the authentic British, Carry On spirit come through. No, I don't mean the film series Carry On, although those are great movies. But I'm talking about, the whole, endurance kind of thing. And I just thought that was a great moment.
The stiff upper lip,
Yeah. I thought that was a great moment because it's like, I don't care that I'm starving. What I care about is that you're not getting what you want from me, which I think is great. But I'm a sick person, so I am fueled by not giving in to people. So there's that. Okay. Where are we in the story now? We are in the point where, let's see. I have a clip here that I can show that will help us. I think it will get us on track. So stand by.
It will not be necessary for officers to do manual labor.
He's done it.
we were talking about those reversals, Tony. Like at first, Nicholson walks in and Saito is like this immovable force. And he's brutal. And William Holden's warning him. And you're on William Holden's point of view about it. You've just seen him bury a guy and can't even remember his name. You're just like, oh my God, this Nicholson guy is like totally naive. And what's about to happen? And then all of a sudden, Nicholson has worn this guy down almost in like a what about Bob kind of scenario where he just won't quit. And he's got the guy crying in his bedroom. Like he's given in to everything. It really is like a mind trip to watch some of this stuff happen where these two guys just stare each other down to the point that you can't predict who's going to win.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is what I mean when I talk about the film being so surprising. I knew that it was somewhat of a psychological conflict that was going to be fleshed out in this movie, but to actually watch it play out and the back and forth and and the effect that it has on Saito in the end, it's like, yeah, this guy cannot be bargained with. It's the way it is. But then, of course, it then leads into Nicholson saying, all right, if, you know, I've had this hard-fought psychological battle with Saito. We won. Now we're going to show him how damn good of a bridge we can build.
Right. Which is also kind of and I'm so glad.
Another backflip.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that the writing is such in this movie that most of the time when you're watching this film and you go, other characters go at the same time. And so your thoughts do get expressed. He does give his explanations. And I guess your mileage may vary if his explanations of why he's going to build this bridge are as effective as his explanation for how surrendering was an order. We will see. There is... I just want to address this super chat real quick from Parker Cohen. It's not really relevant to the war stories thing, but I hear you, and everybody's doing what they can, sir. We're all doing what we can. So let me see here. So we've got this is where the moment he commits to building this bridge, he says that the reason he's doing it is because he sees it as an opportunity to refocus the morale of all the men, get them back on a focused track and make them operating like soldiers again and not as a rabble. And first he goes and he surveys how things are going. Now that none of his officers have to work and they can only supervise or they only have to supervise. And there's this guy, he's the guy who said he's done it. That guy, he's an enlisted man. He's one of the ones, he was the one that said, let go. And they all let go and it, crashed the whole thing. He's the guy who's sort of unofficially, I guess, organized the slacker strategy for keeping this bridge from being built. And he and Nicholson have this little exchange when Nicholson's asking him what he's doing and how many men are in his patrol or in his work group. And this is what he says to him.
The corporal should always know exactly how many men he has under him at all times.
Oh, yes, sir.
Have you a nervous affliction? If not, stop making those faces at once.
Like, dude, I'm trying to tell you that I've got a plan and we're slowing the Japanese down. And he's like, he goes right past that. It's just like, you're supposed to be working like a soldier. I want to see you do better.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then his officers have a conversation with him about it. And this is where the explanations come in. And I have edited this for the YouTube gods and whatever. Hopefully it'll be better than how it turned out with Flyboys, but here we go.
You mean you really wanted to build a bridge?
You're not usually so slow in the uptake, Evans. Fact is, if there weren't any work for them to do, we'd invent some, eh, Reeves?
That we would, sir.
But it's going to be a proper bridge.
It's like this delusion of grandeur where it's like, we British can build bridges better than anyone. That's probably very true, especially in 1941, whatever it was. But at the same time, it's like, And I loved the fact that the moment he said that, and I went, the guy goes, "You actually want us to build this bridge?" Like, you know, and I'm going, "Yeah, dude, represent." Like, I'm just like, "Yeah, yes." Well, you know, and so his rationale is quite interesting, Tony. What do you think of that rationale?
I do struggle with it. It's testament to such a brilliantly written character that incredibly unique, you know, backed up by one of Alec Guinness's greatest. I don't think this is his greatest performance, but it's one of.
Yeah, it's one of them. Yeah,
yeah. He sells it though. He sells it's. Having been in the military, they say, you know, there is a soldier's only happy when he's complaining. It's like if a soldier doesn't have something to complain about, you need to start getting worried.
Right.
So that really ties into the line where he's like, you know, if there wasn't work to do, we'd invent some.
Yep.
The military would, because they would. It'd be like, okay, well, now we're doing physical training, or we're doing this, or they can create work out of thin air.
Right.
But yeah, to just have this, it's a portrayal all about the conviction of the human spirit, I suppose, whether you agree with some of his decisions or not. But that also ties into really, you would call this an anti-war film.
Yeah, in many ways, because of Holden's Shear's attitude towards it, which we'll see later, and then also Nicholson in many ways. He's not anti-war, but he's not overtly anti-war, but he's clearly not interested in getting back in the fight. Like, he's more interested in just kind of living in this principled philosophical world where he starts to build up, no pun intended, he builds up this bridge in his mind of it being a loftier lodestone than it really is. And he starts to make it something of greater importance than I think everybody else is thinking about it as. It's almost as if he's had some kind of midlife crisis or mental breakdown around the time of the surrender, and he hasn't found himself, and now he's just kind of adrift in his own head. And I don't know, it seems like the bridge gives him something that makes him feel relevant. Wicked Person, thank you for the super chat. Cheers to you as well. And so we have this moment where he has this meeting with Saitu. He gets all of his officers together after they've done the survey, and they get all of Saitu's officers together, and they go into his personal, you know, hut or whatever it is, his big, you know, real estate area. And they're having this big meeting, and he just starts laying it on the line with Saitu. And he gets quite catty about certain things. And I've got sort of a clip show right here to show you. And it goes, for those of you that need some context, it starts with them reporting to Saitu about what they found about the bridge after surveying the area. Then they start asking if lunch and dinner can be served, because they're going to have a long meeting and they're going to be there. And in the process, they basically bogart through the Japanese authority, and they just take over the whole project and every decision. And by the end of it, Saitu is just kind of like, Nicholson keeps asking for things, and he's just staring into the middle distance. He's like, I've already given the order. I've already given the order. Yeah, I've already given the order. And he's a man that's truly been broken.
The position of the bridge was fixed rather hastily, and, I have to add, incorrectly.
Incorrectly?
The river bottom there is too soft.
Too soft?
We've wasted over a month through an unfortunate disagreement, for which I was not to blame.
I mean, and right at the very end, when they're leaving, he's like, well, you know, we would have had an extra month to do this, but there was this disagreement, and it wasn't my fault, and I think we all know who it was. It's like, wow. You know, like, dang. So
he's taking he's taking great pleasure in it, and it's
yes.
I think in Nicholson's mind, he is very much winning the war against the Japanese.
Yes.
In this psychological battle with Saito. It's just a shame that not everyone else sees it the same way that he does.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like it's like are we still in the war? Or have we all decided we're just gonna have this kind of island to ourselves? We're all gonna build this bridge. It's gonna be fun. Parker, thank you again for the super chat. I don't know James Rolfe. He has a much larger channel than I do. I mean, that guy's got like 4 million subs. I don't know the guy. Great channel. I don't know him. So I have no connection to do a live stream with him. Wes, thank you so much for the kind super chat. He says, one of my favorite war films being discussed by my two favorite content creators. Cheers, lads. So that's very kind. Thank you, Wes.
Thanks, Wes.
Appreciate it. Very much appreciated. All right, so we finally catch up with Shears at this point, which almost feels like I think it's a little, maybe it's a little less or a little more than halfway through the movie, and we catch up with Shears and find out that he was found by a seaplane that was flying over, and they got him in the nick of time, and they took him to hospital, and he's been rejuvenated back to health, and he's really enjoying himself on the beach with this fetching blonde nurse, and that's when Jack Hawkins comes up to him, and he introduces himself, and he asks him if he wouldn't mind coming to a meeting at his headquarters, to talk about where he was in the jungle and where he approximately escaped. And Shears is like, well, I already kind of gave that information in my debrief. And he goes, I know, but if you could just go over it with us, that'd be very helpful, because, we kind of have a show we're about to put on, and it would just be really good. And he's like, all right. So the next morning he heads over there, and he's in his dress khakis, and he gets jumped by this dude with a knife. And he doesn't realize that he's walking through a training exercise, even though he's walking down a paved path. So this happens.
Always use your knife immediately, Joyce. Immediately, man. You see, he's gained the initiative.
And I do love the fact that in this case, you can tell that he is holding a rubber knife, because he would be in a training exercise. Like, he's holding like the knife as well, but he's supposed to be like, it's not a prop issue. He's actually in a training situation. And the guy's like, you're supposed to have already stabbed him already. What are you doing? Which is going to become a plot point later, because this individual, who's a Canadian army officer, he's part of this commando unit. So we get to the point where he finally gets to Jack Hawkins' office. It's Jack Hawkins. Yeah, not Dawkins. Dawkins is he's a game show host. Jack Hawkins.
Well, for me, I was watching the film. First of all, I'm trying to think what country they're in the story. Malaysia or wherever. Yeah. When it cuts to Shears in this new look, it was very shocking for me, because I just assumed this whole movie was centered around, and shot around the bridge there. And then all of a sudden, you've got this, they're still in a tropical environment, but you've got these beautiful garden beds in these nice, almost French-styled building. And Jack Hawkins comes into it, and straight away I'm just like, oh, it's the preacher from Rorke's Drift.
Well, go ahead.
It took me a moment to get used to it, because the character is very, very different. A very different character.
Yeah. I found out some interesting trivia about this. It was one of the biggest points of contention between David Lean and the producer Spiegel, which was they got some notes back from Columbia Pictures during the initial first cut or whatever it was. And the brass at Columbia Pictures were like, this is what they said. Okay. which is bad, but this is what they said. They said there are no white women in this movie. And David Lean was like, huh? And they said, we need some romance between our movie star and a white woman. And he's like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, it has nothing to do with the plot. And they were like, well, we're just not confident that we can sell this film unless we have a little bit of something. Can we shoot some scenes with like a British nurse? And he was like, okay. And so they went and they shot these scenes much to David Lean's frustration, because he knew the movie didn't need it. He was like, this movie needs to go straight to Shears being introduced to Jack Hawkins. That's what needs to happen, because he's got to be, well, the odd part is that the movie did really, really, really well, obviously. But then when you flash forward to Lawrence of Arabia in 1962, also a David Lean production, also a Columbia picture, at that point, notice there was no forced scene with some random white woman character. In fact, there were no women in the movie at all. It was just World War I out in the desert with the Bedouin. Like, it was that. And it was almost, I wonder if it was finally he had like said, see, the movie really didn't need this. It did just fine, and was able to use his clout for that later. Anyway, I digress. But
the really interesting, I mean, that makes total sense to me, because it really did feel like a shoehorned it. When I was watching it, particularly when I watched it the second time, I almost felt like that, 99% of the movie was directed by David Lean. And it was like, oh, did he get the assistant director to do that little thing there,
I think he did it, but did it not badly. I think he wasn't putting his effort into that, because it was like a executive requested reshoot. It was like an add-on that he didn't want to do.
William Holden, he comes out of the water like Daniel Craig in Casino.
Yes. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, there is a small kind of romantic subplot later in the film.
Right.
But it's not with a white woman.
Right. That was the exact
phrasing of the times.
Yeah, that was the exact phrasing was, we need a white woman in this movie. And I'm not like, it's just kind of like, there is romance in this film. There is, and it's more subtly played out. It doesn't feel like a Gidget movie. It doesn't feel like, it is strange. But also, fun fact, because you mentioned Holden coming out of the water like Daniel Craig. Fun fact, everyone, William Holden had to shave his chest for this movie. William Holden was actually a rather hirsute individual on his chest. And he shaved his chest for this movie because they wanted to get maximum beefcake effect out of his physique. So the things you learn when you're doing a War Stories episode, the things you learn. So he goes to Jack Hawkins' office, and Jack Hawkins starts telling him about the commando operation that they've got going on. And then the bomb drops, metaphorically. Tony, walk us through this bomb.
Mentally, I kind of struggled to keep up with this. I can
take you through it if you want.
Yeah, please.
I'm no pressure. If you'd like to take it, that's fine. You find out as I'm just going to keep calling him Jack Hawkins. You find out that Hawkins is wanting to recruit Shears to go with his team back into the jungle of Thailand. And he wants Shears to lead him to the bridge because he knows he was at that POW camp and escaped from it. And Shears is like, this is crazy. I just got out of there. Everybody agrees it was a miraculous escape. There is no reason that I should be expected to go back in. And he's like, well, yeah, I know this is awkward. And he's like, but we have gotten the agreement from the US Navy to borrow you for a while. And then William Holden Shears is like, ha, got you there, because those papers aren't worth the ink, that's on them, because I'm not actually Shears. I'm another guy. And he's like, yeah, I hate to break this to you. We already know that too. And it's like, oh, wah, wah. And so what happened was he had come ashore after his boat had been sunk. He'd come ashore with an officer. The officer had died. And he realized that if he was caught by the Japanese, he definitely wanted to be an officer. He didn't realize it wasn't going to matter one way or the other, but he thought that if he was an officer, he'd be given better treatment. Of course, he wasn't. When he got back and he was in hospital, he realized that the officers had better facilities and better privileges in hospital than the enlisted men. And since nobody was questioning his rank, he was just going to ride on it for a little while. And he's even saying to Hawkins, you know what? I can't wait to be thrown in the brig for this rather than go back there. And then Hawkins keeps checkmating him every time. Like, yeah, we kind of already know that. And this is very awkward, but yeah. And so it all kind of plays out like this.
Major, I just got out of there. My escape was a miracle. Even your people said so. And now you want me to go back? Don't be ridiculous. No, but they can't do this to me. I really mean it. My Navy's made a mistake. Uh-oh. And my Navy finds out who I am. Those temporary orders you've got won't be worth the paper they're written on.
Your Navy's in an awkward position. In one sense, you're a blasted hero. But at the same time, they can't very well bring you home and give you the Navy Cross for impersonating an officer, can they?
As long as I'm hooked, I might as well volunteer.
Good show.
He's just volunteered to go back and help me blow up the Kwai Bridge.
Really? Good show. Jolly good show, Major.
I love that shit. Like I love the fact that you've got him, just because this guy, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, this guy Hawkins, played by Hawkins, is a demolitions addict. He loves, coming up with explosives and playing with bombs. He loves blowing up bridges, and he loves his work. He loves what he does. And so he's a military guy. He's a commando. He's all this stuff. And so right as he's politely checkmated Shears on every attempt to get out of this operation, that's when you've got the career military high-ranking guy who was obviously in World War I, may have even been as old enough to be in the Boer War for all I know. Like, the guy was just, and he comes in and he is old school, like Victorian, era, just bam, and I just think to myself, I love his reaction, because Hawkins doesn't let on that this guy, I'm sure he's already apprised of the situation, but Hawkins doesn't embarrass him in front of the guy. He's so happy that just as a gesture, even sarcastically, Shears has volunteered, and he's just like, all sins are forgiven now. This is great. Hey, this guy just volunteered. And he's like, really? And you're just like, oh, so good. It's so good. Anyway, I'm talking too much about this.
Jason Anderson had a great comment earlier.
What did he say?
He's talking about Shears, and he's like, I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude. That never occurred to me that, perhaps Robert Downey Jr.'s character in Tropic Thunder is based on Shears.
Right. Oh, George Aiken says, how come every British commando film has to have a nutty explosives expert?
And I like the fact that you use the word nutty there, George, because we start to learn that Hawkins is a little bit mad himself.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of mad characters in this.
Yeah.
With William Holden, the American, probably being the most sane one of the lot, or him and the medical officer, I suppose.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, we then also get introduced that they need another person to go with them.
Right.
What I'm told, yes. They need another individual to go with them. And they have this young Canadian officer who is the one that tackles Shears to the ground when he's first walking into Hawkins' office. And he's a young Canadian officer. He kind of fits the bill for almost all of it, but they have some reservations about him because he's not been battle tested.
Right. Right.
You know, so they kind of set that up, and then the three of them, do they do a parachute drop, I think?
Yeah, the guy who gets scolded for not immediately stabbing William Holden with the rubber knife is the guy. And this is the moment where they bring him in to sort of assess him to see if he's good for the team.
Are you quite sure you'll be able to use it in cold blood?
I suppose I find it hard to kid myself that killing isn't a crime.
Oh, you see what I mean? Well, at least he was honest about it, sir.
If he wants to go that bad, he can even take my place.
Oh, so good. And then they you're right, they say they have to do a parachute drop, and so it's Hawkins, and then I'm just gonna call him like Lord Kitchener or whatever, the head guy, the older guy, and they're talking about this first William Holden is talking to the head man just about how crazy the Hawkins guy is. You know, he's like, he seems like a wingnut, you know, like he's, you know, oh, well, he's blown up bridges all over the place and all that kind of stuff. And then Hawkins comes running back up the hill to inform them that, you know, because William Holden is still trying to find every possible way to get out of this. And he's like, we're going to do a parachute drop. And he's like, have you had parachute training? And he's like, no. Does that disqualify me? And they're like, we'll see if we can get you some parachute training. And he's like, oh. And so then he comes running back with the answer about the parachute training, and he says this.
The consensus of opinion is that the most sensible thing for Major Shears to do is to go ahead and jump and hope for the best.
With or without parachute.
I wish there was a whole movie with that guy. He's so great. Oh, so good.
And this is really what I mean when I was. Well, another reason why I say this movie surprised me so much is much like yourself. I'm laughing through all of these scenes.
Yeah.
I'm like, I've always had in my head that, you know, this is that Japanese prisoner of war movie that you can't play in the house when Granddad comes round because he might go nutty.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's like there's a there's a lighter-hearted intermission that's not an intermission. It's just more of a respite from the jungle cruelty. And then they get right back into it after. They give you a breather and then they go right back. While they're doing this, the doctor at the medical officer at the POW camp has a conversation with Nicholson because he's saying, this bridge building thing, you're going at it with a fervor where it could be seen as collaborating with the enemy. And they have this little bit of an exchange.
The fact is, what we're doing could be construed as, forgive me, sir, collaboration with the enemy.
We are prisoners of war. We haven't the right to refuse work.
Must we build them a better bridge than they could have built for themselves?
If you had to operate on Saito, would you do your best or would you let him die?
Once again, the man is a master lawyer and doesn't know it, because I'm sitting there going, yeah, dude, this is collaborating with the enemy. And the medic's got a point. And then he's like, if you were operating on somebody that was the enemy, would you do your best work or your worst work? And I'm going, I don't think these are the same things. This may be a false equivalency at work, but he's almost sold me on this. Like, again, you know?
Absolutely.
It's just kind of like, damn it, you win again. Well played, Nicholson. Well played. I still don't agree with you, but once again, I have to walk away with my tail tucked. Just because I'm like, oh, all right. Okay. Now, we are at the parachute drop. They parachute in, And when they do, I can't remember, is it the radio man or the explosives expert that breaks his neck on the landing? There's 4 that drop in. It's Holden, Hawkins, the Canadian guy, and another guy. The one guy gets killed when he gets caught in the tree.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, great. Now we're down to 3. And they get picked up by their Thai contact. He's like their sort of Thai underground guy. He takes them into the village and tells them, we're going to be giving you some female bearers for the equipment because all of our men have been taken and conscripted by the Japanese to build these railroads, and we don't have anybody in the village over the age of whatever. And then they find out that they've also got some slightly adjusted orders. And here we go.
Guy says we'll never reach the Kwai by the route you took. There are too many Japanese patrols now.
You speak Yai's language. I don't. He's going to lead you back to the River Kwai himself, by a route I never took. Will someone tell me why I'm so indispensable to this outfit?
Well, they can tell you, Shears, but it's too late now because you're there.
Yeah. You're not getting out of it. Yeah.
You can parachute into the jungle. You can't parachute out. The
True.
Parachute's down.
True. Oh, man.
But this parachute drop into the jungle. This is now we're into the third act of the film, and we're following this party of 3 with all of the female. I want to say Sherpas. I don't know if they call them Sherpas in Thailand, but,
right?
You know, they're carrying all the extra equipment, particularly the explosives, and moving through the jungle. Beautifully shot, I must say. These jungle scenes, you know. Another director would have shot a lot of this on a soundstage. Not David Lean.
No, not at all.
No, was it shot in? I know the bridge was in Sri Lanka.
It was shot in Sri Lanka, and it's exactly in the same spot where they shot Temple of Doom with the elephants.
Oh wow, really? Okay.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've often wondered. They talk about on Temple of Doom how excited Spielberg was to be shooting in the same locations as Bridge on the River Kwai. And the whole scene where Willie thinks they're birds and they're all the bats. I have often wondered, and again, they had the money on Temple of Doom to set off the loud bang and have all the bats fly if they wanted to and film it. But sometimes I wonder if they just didn't borrow stock footage of all the bats from this movie to use for that one insert shot. They probably redid it because the bats are all still there, but I have wondered sometimes. It's a gorgeous location, but it's very hard to shoot in. And some of the trivia that I learned was that nobody except David Lean was enjoying the jungle climate. David Lean was apparently like a duck in water in that climate. He never complained, but everybody else was kind of like, ugh, this is awful. You know, like they were just like, oh God.
Oh yeah. And let me tell you, it is.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
It's like walking through air or water suspended in air. So now we have this scene here where oh yes, I remember what this is now. Some of my captions they probably should have been done better because now I'm like, train and bridge. Well done, Michael. I have no idea what that means. But I'm on it now. So they get into the jungle and they're headed toward where they think the bridge is going to be, because the British have actually told the Japanese that they're moving the entire side of the bridge down several hundred meters. And so they have to, even the commando group is now adjusting to that intelligence. They think the radio isn't working. Holden Shears gets mad. He says there's no reason for us to be here. He kicks the radio real hard and the radio starts working. No, it's not shot in a comedic way, despite the way it sounded when I said it. So don't think for a minute it was like a sight gag. They get the radio working and they get an intelligence update from their command. And this is what happens.
If we set a faster pace, we could make it before sundown on the 12th. It's worth having a go for the train, don't you think?
Oh, by all means. Good hunting. Good show. Jolly good fun. Jolly good.
So they found out that the train, they think a Japanese train, the first one to traverse this bridge, will be there on the 12th, which is a few days earlier than when they expected to reach the bridge.
Yeah.
So now they need to hoof it. At this point, we find out that Nicholson has really started to go over the edge with his ambitions for this bridge. And he wants it to be done by the time this train arrives. He really wants this to be a huge, successful day for all of his men. Like it's going to be this point of pride. He convinces all the officers to start working on the bridge. And then...
Which when you think about it, right?
Right? It's like...
He let himself get put in an oven for days on end. He was I was going to say broken. He wasn't broken mentally, but he was, severely physically deteriorated by the time he came out. All down to the principle of the fact that officers don't work. In this setting, and now it's like now the officers got to work, and it's like what?
Yeah, huh? Boom! Just like what? And then he takes it one step further, dare I say, a bridge too far, with this moment.
Look here, sir. There's not a man in this hospital who doesn't belong there.
There are always a few malingerers, aren't there? Be honest now. Keep an open mind, that's all I ask.
Let's make the wounded work.
Yeah,
we've got to get my bridge built. This is where the only way that I can get my head around this is to go, he's a pastiche of French officers. He's a pastiche of French officers. He's a pastiche of French officers. Meanwhile, in the jungle, they're accelerating the pace. They're at a waterfall. They're all washing up because they've been walking through the jungle forever. It's a big multi-storied, famous waterfall. We've seen it in a few films.
Yep.
And, well, these Japanese soldiers come wandering in because they hear the female bearers all enjoying the water. And all the guys are kind of like ducked down with their Sten guns. Like, what are we going to do? Well, they jump up with their Sten guns and they shoot all the Japanese guys except for one who gets away into the jungle. And so Canadian boy chases him in there with a knife before they don't want him to get back and report what's happened. And of course, this is what happens.
I could have done it. I was ready.
So the guy they were worried about, who had already shown in training that he hesitated to use a rubber knife, hesitates at a crucial moment. Hawkins has to kill the guy, and the guy's rifle goes down as he gets stabbed, and he pulls the trigger and shoots Hawkins in the foot. So now Hawkins is wounded.
Yep.
Tony, I wanted to ask you this question back at the point where we were talking about their meeting, where they were assessing the guy. I forgot because we were talking about something else. Can't remember. In a situation like that, where you are, because you were SAS, in a situation like that where you're assessing who's going to go, if there's even the slightest question like that about a person's performance at that stage, I'm not saying that they're a washout yet, but you've exhibited, or you've observed this kind of behavior they've exhibited. What would your reaction be, really? Like, is that accurate or not?
They wouldn't get selected. However, I do need to kind of put myself in the mindset that this is World War II.
Right. No, of course.
Is at war. And in the modern day, it's like, no, he's not the right man for the job. There'll be somebody else.
Yeah.
Perhaps they didn't have anybody else. But it's funny, since we've been doing this War Stories series, right? When I watched this film for the first time about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and we got to, we have the setup in the office. Of,
Mhm.
Well, there's three scenes that's stringed together here.
Mhm.
First is when he grabs Shears when he first arrives at the office and hesitates. Then they discuss his, lack of combat experience in the office, and then we get to this, and I'm like, that's playing out with the character, and I'm thinking, do you remember all the conversations we had about the illogical characters in the Hurt Locker?
Yes. Yes.
So I was watching this, and the first thing that sprung into my mind at this scene was going, was all the conversations we had about the Hurt Locker was what was popping into my head at the time, and how different these two films are in the way they treat characters and character logic and people's motivations. And
I think in one respect, a lot of that has to do with this being adapted from a book, or novel, I should say, to be specific. And what I mean by that is it's come through a filter. Certainly Hollywood has added things into it, like The Nurse and other things to try and give it, to check its boxes. But Hurt Locker, as we know, started as like a screenplay. I believe it started just as a screenplay. I think I could be wrong about that, but I know that the screenwriter said he was embedded in with an IED disposal unit and stuff like that, and we all laughed about that during that episode of War Stories. But there is something to be said for, I found when I was reading scripts in Hollywood, for ones that are just fresh off the page from a screenwriter that have no basis in literature, and ones that are adapted from literature. I don't mean to sound snobby about that. There are some very, very good movies that started as screenplays and never were a book or anything else. But sometimes you just get that feeling where you go, novelist, screenwriter, Shakespeare. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's, so we then have this argument because Hawkins, who is determined to get to the bridge and determined not to let anybody down, keeps walking on his busted foot through the jungle, even going so far as to cut his boot off on the side of what looks like a volcanic rock hill. And the foot just keeps getting worse. And they're only a few hours from the bridge at that point, and we have this moment where Hawkins is insistent that they leave him behind and get to the bridge, and they refuse to do so.
If you were in my shoes, Joyce, I wouldn't hesitate to leave you here, and you know that.
He doesn't know it, but I do. You'd leave your own mother here if the rules called for it.
I mean, and while Holden isn't wrong, part of me, and Tony, I can't speak to this from any firsthand experience, but my instincts with both interviewing military people for a large part of my career, military combat veterans, and then also all the history I've read and stuff, I feel like in this moment, Hawkins actually is having the right idea. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but Hawkins is having this idea of leave me here, come back and get me later. He's not dying. He just can't keep up. He's not mortally wounded. He just can't keep up. And he knows that he's going to slow them down. And they're like, no, we're not going to leave you behind. And I'm going, is this Hollywood coming into this again to try and like make a statement or something? Because I would think that the objective would be paramount when there's not somebody, and sometimes even when there is somebody mortally wounded, the objective is still paramount. I don't know. It just rang kind of movie drama.
Yeah, and certainly, like, you would look at this as a type of special forces operation. I don't even know if they really used the term special forces back then, but this is a small commando raid. These are hand-picked men. I mean, the SAS was birthed in North Africa in World War II with them going behind enemy lines to destroy German airfields, and you would especially pick men who can make those kinds of decisions, and I would almost say that even if he was mortally wounded, with such a critical target and time frame, potentially you might leave him behind. But in this scenario, almost definitely, where it's get me on the way, blow the bridge up and get me on the way back. You know? So,
and of course they say, well, we don't know if we're going to be coming back the same way, so we can't guarantee that we'll even be able to find you or anything like that. And I get their logic. And ultimately, he does serve a purpose because he switches out roles with somebody else when they get to the site. He operates the mortar from the cliff above, which helpful-ish, I guess, or not. Actually, now that I think about it, probably not. Yeah, it just seemed like it was like, oh, this is kind of like the Hollywood drama coming into it, which could very well be in the novel. I don't know, but I haven't read the original novel. Wes, thank you so much for the kind super chat. He says, wow, nice lore drop, Michael. How much prep do you do for this stuff? Loving it. I'm glad you're enjoying it. We do this for our own fun, but we hope you all have fun listening to it as well and watching it. Gerard, thank you for the super.
And also learning.
Yeah.
You know, I got to finally sit down and watch a classic movie that I've always wanted to see.
Yeah.
And throughout the duration of it, I've learned that Temple of Doom was filmed in the same, or parts of Temple of Doom filmed in the same location. You learned that the guy who wrote the novel also wrote Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
I learned that Nicholson's character is a pastiche of the French. It's all about you've come here today for an education. Jolly good show.
That's right. Damn right. And you know, that's why I so much enjoy, as I sound as pretentious as probably I ever have on the show. That's why I so much enjoy this show, because there's so much to learn from these. And when I say learn from these movies, I don't always necessarily mean positively, but Tony and I are able, truly, without any irony or sarcasm, Tony and I are able to give each other kernels of information that either of us previously didn't have. And so, you know, and that can be invaluable. Like, I learned, thanks to Tony, that the Hurt Locker was shit. And then and then Tony learned from me that Flyboys is shit. Like, it's a trading of information.
Do you remember though when I first messaged you and said, "Hey, that's right," because we were going to do we were going to review a film about Russians in Afghanistan and the Ukraine. We had to change tack at the last minute, and I remember messaging you about the Hurt Locker. Have you ever seen it? And you know, I haven't, but I remember when it came out at the time, and everyone was telling me how amazing it was, and I was like, yes. I knew everyone at the time would tell you that, and I knew Michael would see through the bullshit.
It's like I've set up a minefield for Michael. It's a non-lethal minefield. But it's going to be very entertaining. And that was kind of the way it was kind of the opposite, because I didn't remember how exactly I felt about Flyboys. I knew it wasn't great. That's all I remembered, because it'd been so long. When I watched it, I was like, oh God, I've set up the same minefield for Tony and I didn't even know it. Like, anyway. Gerard, thank you for the super chat. He says, hey, all, late to the parade, going to jump back to the beginning. Be well and stay safe. We will, sir. And thank you for being here. All right. So we are now at the point where we mentioned earlier in this episode, Tony, about Nicholson's state of mind and the possibility that he might be going through some kind of personal, not crisis, but not crisis of even conscience, but a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it. He's kind of a man at a crossroads in his own psyche. He doesn't know much about his place in the world and what his purpose is. And this bridge has temporarily given him purpose, which is why he's over-indexed on it. And he talks to Saitu on the finished bridge at sunset about these feelings that he's having, about most people have achieved more in the military and in their lives than me. And excuse me, he says, I don't know if I should compare myself to other men, but I guess all of us do at some point. And I don't know what my life's meaning is, but I got to find meaning and my purpose and all this kind of stuff. But the most telling aspect, I think, of the exchange is right at the beginning, because he's sitting there leaning on the railing of the bridge, watching the sun set over the trees past the river. And Saito comes walking up behind him. But I mean, at this point, Saito's basically given Nicholson like free reign of going wherever he wants at any time, because it's like, you know, the guy clearly isn't trying to escape. So, and he's built me this kick-ass bridge. So like, whatever. And Nicholson is just sitting there looking out, and Saito says he sees the sunset and he's like, ah, beautiful. And Nicholson's response, you can see when he responds, you watch Saito's face.
Beautiful. Yes, beautiful. A first-rate job. I had no idea it would turn out so well.
I think I cut off a little bit of it, but you see the start of it where Saito is kind of like, I was talking about the sunset, asshole. I wasn't talking about the bridge.
Yeah,
yeah. And then he kind of like, in the Japanese way, he, even though he's done the maths in his head, and he's like, oh, I understand what he was referring to, even though that's kind of weird. He allows Nicholson to save face, because then he says, yes, it's a wonderful construct or something like that. He's like, it's a, you know, which I thought was kind of a cool scene. But then Nicholson accidentally drops his swagger stick into the river. And he's like, oh, and there's this moment where I've interpreted it this way my whole life, but I don't know if it's right or not. But he drops his swagger stick and he's like, oh. And then he turns around and Saito is standing right behind him. And I felt like there was this moment where, because he had dropped his officer's stick, and this is me, I could have this all wrong. I felt like he was looking at Saito like, oh, I guess I'm just a prisoner again now, because the bridge is finished and I've got nothing left to tell people to do until we move on to the next camp. And there's the guy who's actually in charge of everything. It's almost like he had the keys to the car, and now he has to give the keys back to Saito or something. I don't know. That was just me. I don't know what you thought of that, but
no, I've very similar thoughts. It's almost as though, you know, you hear these stories about the British and the Germans in World War II, who they might play a football match, and it's almost as they pour their heart and soul into it. You know, the POWs against the German guards, and I'm not talking about Victory with Sylvester Stallone. You know, they had this great moment of triumph, perhaps, when they played this game of football and they beat them, but then afterwards, it's what now? We're just prisoners again.
Yeah. It's exactly like that. That's how I've always interpreted it, as him kind of being like, oh, I guess I better go back to the camp now. And then he says to Saito, he's like, well, the men have got some entertainment set up for us tonight, so I should probably make an appearance and go back there. Carry on. Thank you for the super chat, Zirak. He says, hope you guys are doing well. The most I know about the bridge on the River Kwai is from a Parks and Recreation episode. It is Ron Swanson's, I say, favorite film. It's one of the only films Ron Swanson has ever seen, according to the character. But it is a great one, and you should definitely watch it if you get a chance. You should not allow yourself to go through life only watching movies that have Spider-Man or Jedi in them, okay?
Or digital effects.
Reclaim your bounty, people.
Yeah.
I have that movie, George. I have Escape to Victory on Blu-ray, no less. We are a Sylvester Stallone family here, so as you can imagine.
Well, as I think I've got it on. I don't think I've got it on Blu-ray. I have it on DVD. But you know, Michael Caine, Sylvester Stallone.
Yeah,
how can you not?
I mean, I never thought I would see the day where, I mean, the inner recesses of my mind dreamt of it, I'm sure, but I don't think I thought I would see the day where I would see a movie. And I learned about that movie later in life, like 5 years ago. I never thought I would see a movie where he's like, I mean, you know, we got to like stop these Nazis at their own game. You know, I mean, it's got what we got to do. And I'm like, oh my God, this is awesome. Rambo in World War II, you know? All right. So at the entertainment, which I didn't pull any clips for, they're doing a stage show. You know, they pull together costumes and do a funny stage show to keep all the troops entertained. But at the end, Nicholson is giving this speech. Now, while Nicholson is giving the speech, Shears and the Canadian guy have reached the bridge with Hawkins on the cliff above with the female bearers and the mortar. It's at night. They're down under the bridge and they're laying the charges. They're laying the plastic explosive and running the wires under the water and all that kind of stuff to get it ready. And Nicholson gives this flowery speech to his men about how one day, many years from now, when you're back home with your families and you're much older, you'll be proud of what you accomplished here at this, you know, this occasion. They've already nailed a plaque to the bridge that, you know, you'll be proud and you'll look back on this with, you know, he's really like projecting like big time, like boom. And the next morning, they've been waiting all night. The Canadian kid is on the other side of the river with the plunger. He's got the explosives plunger because the wires had to run across the other side of the bridge. So the plan is as soon as that train comes across, you blow the bridge and then swim back as fast as you can.
Yep.
Well, Nicholson was allowed to stay behind with a few officers. The rest of the men have been moved on to the next POW camp. Nicholson has been allowed to stay behind to celebrate with the Japanese the train coming across. The medical officer is like, I'm really not comfortable being there. I'll just sit up on the hill. And Nicholson is like, I seriously don't know what's the matter with you. Sometimes I don't understand you. You are just, you know, you're an odd duck. And then he goes off down to the bridge.
Where's Nicholson as the odd duck?
Oh, I know, right? So Hawkins is watching through his binoculars at the bridge. Holden is looking, Shears is looking through the bridge, or looking through the binoculars down at the bridge. And they see Nicholson walking back and forth across the railing, looking down at the water. And then Nicholson starts to act weird.
What's he doing?
Colonel, there's something rather odd going on. I think we better have another look round before that train comes across.
The water had gone lower overnight. They hadn't considered that. So the wires were now visible in certain places. And Nicholson has decided that, oh, something fishy's going on. We should probably tell the commander of the Japanese POW camp, and we should check it out together. Not really feeling comfortable about what's that's where you kind of know, okay, regardless of all the character reversals that have happened over the last almost or over 2 hours, I think we can finally say that Nicholson has gone over the edge. Like we can confirm that he has lost himself in this. And there was a moment here that I forgot to show, but I'm so glad that I remembered it just now. It's from earlier and it's about Nicholson, where I was supposed to show it in sequence, but I forgot and skipped over it. Shears asks Hawkins about Nicholson's behavior. He doesn't assume Hawkins even knows Nicholson, but he wants to ask him this one point.
Say, do your intelligence people have any idea what happened to that Colonel Nicholson? No. He had the guts of a maniac. They were about to shoot him and he didn't bat an eye.
Well, I suppose if you're about to be shot, there isn't a great deal you can do, is there?
Which, okay, so Hawkins' response is really funny. I'll grant you that. But Shears is bringing up a great point, which is like, you know, these are the kind of guts that are going to get you killed. He said that to the guys in the hospital. He's telling Hawkins, this Colonel Nicholson, he was so strange in his behavior that even though I got out of there alive by a miracle and was motivated to leave because of the dust he was stirring up with Saito, I still got to ask somebody in the British Army about this, because something ain't right here. Like,
yeah.
You know, he's still thinking about the guy. So he sees Nicholson acting weird. He's like, what's he doing? And Nicholson and Saito are now on the bank of the river. And he finds the detonation wire, and he starts lifting it up out of the sand and following it. And he's getting closer and closer to the Canadian kid with the explosives plunger.
It's actually the image in this backdrop behind me and Michael right now.
Yes.
This is it. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Good call, Tony. I didn't totally forgot about that. So we have this moment here.
I was right. There is something going on.
Have you a knife? I've just realized the bridge has been mined.
Mined?
Good boy.
So the Canadian kid redeems himself because he doesn't hesitate. He runs up and he kills Saito, just as a commando should, right? And then here comes the mind game. Here comes the mind fuck. Here comes what happens next, man?
Well, Nicholson turns on his own. I really struggled with it the first time. He cannot bear to see his bridge destroyed.
Yeah. Even though he
has lost all perspective of the war and who's on what side. This is my bridge and I'll protect my bridge. And it's like, damn it, man, you have lost the plot. You have gone insane in the jungle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the bridge is in the service of the enemy. So, I mean, he's really lost perspective on all of this, like you said. And there's another mind game going on here, because the Canadian guy has finally steeled himself to kill the enemy. He is not mentally prepared to kill someone that he knows is on his side. As far as the uniform and everything else, there's another person wearing a British uniform, and he's a higher ranking officer, and he is now attacking me. But the first thing in his mind is not do what I did to Saito to this guy. Yeah. He can't get there. And so you have this very tense moment.
British officer, here to blow up the bridge. Blow up the bridge? Yes, sir. Help! Let me go, sir. You don't understand, sir. Kill him! Kill him!
I mean, you've got Hawkins yelling, kill him, do it now, kill him. And you've got Shears just giving up their position because it's like it's now or never, screaming, kill him. And we as the audience all know, kill him. That's the only way. Like, we're about to lose everything here. This is your, and it's not at this point. I don't know if this makes sense or not, but I was very irritated with the Canadian kid when the Japanese soldier popped up in the jungle. Like, that was annoying. I sympathize with this kid's confusion in this moment. I kind of understand why he doesn't really know what, even though he's already shown that he's not the most cold-blooded killer when he has to be. Yeah. It's still a mind game going on here. Like, is it okay to kill this guy? Like, he's a colonel. Like, what? I don't, what's the right thing to do? Like, really, really, I posit this to everybody watching. Rarely in a movie will you see a more suspenseful scene played out the way it plays out. I mean, it doesn't require 5 villains coming through 17 multiverses and 20 different Spider-Men. And I liked No Way Home, but I'm just saying. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, Scuba Pete has a great comment there. He's like, because the whole time this is happening, you can hear the steam whistle of the train getting closer and closer and closer.
Right.
It is an expertly directed build up of tension.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the final kind of piece of the film, I really feel as though the movie The Bridge on the River Kwai is about a man's descent into madness, but also juxtapositioned with the futility of war. I feel as though The Bridge on the River Kwai's main message is that war is ultimately futile.
Right.
And yeah, and we're just blessed that that message is delivered by some of the greatest acting, cinematography, directing.
Yeah.
The golden age of cinema.
truly from filmmakers who had lives before being filmmakers. Like they were veterans themselves. They were immigrants from, you know, refugee families. They had all these experiences to bring to bear to these movies. And, you know, it's such an interesting writing thing that the reluctant soldier, the Shears, who is the guy who's always looking to find a way out of this hellscape. And I mean, who with common sense wouldn't? I mean, he's not a deserter. He didn't desert the army. Yeah, he impersonated an officer, but he didn't like get cleaned up in the hospital and then try to go AWOL. Like, he was still there. Like, he volunteered, you know, for the mission when he got caught, you know, impersonating an officer. And he's the guy who's like, why am I even here? Like, the whole time he's like, I don't speak the language. You've moved to the location of the thing. We're not even taking the same path back to the jungle. Why am I here? Why am I here? And the moment that he sees the kid get killed by a rifle shot from the alerted Japanese, because Nicholson alerts the Japanese on the bridge and they start shooting. One of the bullets hits the Canadian kid and he gets killed. And Nicholson is still alive, trying to figure out what's going on and everything. The reluctant soldier jumps into the river and desperately tries to cross it as fast as he can to finish the mission. The mission he didn't even want to go on, which is really interesting writing. And he gets to the other side barely, because he's already been shot twice. He's not going to make it, but he tried. He gave it everything he had. And there's this just gut-wrenching moment here, this shocking, like, psychological razor's edge finish right here for these two individuals.
You.
Like, I'm literally bleeding out. I'm dying right here. But the last thing I see is this guy who was so just, I couldn't compute him. He was so bizarre, and I could tell he was making all the wrong moves, and I could not figure him out. And I knew he was a danger to everybody and everything. And that guy, who never expected to see Shears again because he thought he was dead, and there he pops up again right at the last seconds of all of their lives. And like, it's interesting to me because the next moment we see, and I have to believe it's Shears showing up there again that snapped him out of it somehow. I don't know why. I don't know. I would love to hear your take on how and why him popping up again snaps him out of it. But it does. It brings Nicholson back to reality, back to the war, back to the stakes. Why do you think that moment, seeing Shears, did that for him?
All they say to each other is like, you. And it's like, I think it was that finally in that moment, because Nicholson they all thought that Shears was dead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Japanese had told them that all the men who tried to escape were killed. So in that moment, you know, because he's certainly an intelligent man. He might be bizarre, but Nicholson's character is a very intelligent man.
Yeah.
it hasn't taken him long to process that. Oh wait, the guy did survive, which must mean he's escaped, and now because of me, he's back here and he's dead. And trying to compute all of that, yeah, it does. It snaps him out of this bizarre ideal that he's built up in his own mind. Of how important this bridge is and how important what he's done is, and in reality, he won't be sitting there in many years to come with his grandchildren, looking back, being proud. He won't.
Yeah, somebody was just saying that in reality the bridge was blown up by Allied aircraft. Well, yes, of course, we're talking about the fictional movie as it's written by a novelist.
We need 6 hours. Like the original bridge isn't even made of wood.
Right. Yeah, it's made of iron, and it's it was bombed, and original pieces of it are still part of the bridge, and other central sections were rebuilt by the Japanese after the war as war reparations. And yeah, we're aware of all that. It's Jerry, I don't know if I totally. The trouble is that by putting war on a big screen, you're glamorizing it. It's self-defeating to make an anti-war film. I've seen some movies that are starkly anti-war, and they are ham-fisted in their attempt to dissuade people from conflict. I have seen some. I've never seen. I'll put it to you this way: I don't think all films romanticize war. And I think there are films that aren't anti-war that also don't romanticize war. But I also think that anybody with common sense doesn't want to start a war or get into a war. But some of us still have the wherewithal to know that sometimes that conflict is coming down the pipeline at you, whether you want it or not. And yeah, because not all of us.
People of the Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. So in this final, I'm sorry, Tony, did you have something you wanted to say?
It can wait.
Okay. He sees shears, snaps out of it. He says, right before that, he says, "What have I done? What have I done?" And at that moment, one of the mortar shells from Hawkins' mortar lands near him, mortally wounds him. He tries to pick himself up like an officer. And then his body gives out and he falls on the plunger. And the bridge goes up. And then in the final moment, the medic who's sitting up on the hill, safely away from the bridge.
Madness. Madness.
Which then ends in a helicopter shot pulling away from the river. So it's a classic for a reason, because it's so well made. Even as clunky an insert as the nurse scene is, it is a 50s movie, and the studio system back then, they had their way with certain things, but obviously David Lean was able to minimize it as much as he could, because you only see the nurse twice. And they're very
it didn't break the film or the story for me. As a matter of fact, later on, where there's just these kind of passing, these very brief moments where I can't remember which of the characters is it the Canadian officer, but basically there's him and one of the females who are carrying all the equipment, the Thai female. They're clearly starting to show a bit of an affection towards each other. I almost thought the scene with the white woman, it actually makes those other scenes more valuable in a way to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't hate those scenes at all. They're not poorly done or anything. They have good acting in them.
Just weren't necessary.
No, they weren't at all, which is odd for a David Lean film, because most of his films, even when they're long, every scene is necessary. So it's odd for something like that to jump out. And I will say that I do like Lawrence of Arabia more than I like this film, but that's not saying anything negative about this movie. This movie's spectacular. But Michael Schaefer has a beautiful comment here. He says, to see a man that has no principles die to try and blow up the bridge, snap Nicholson back into reality. Yeah. And then Jason Anderson says, it shows Nicholson that if Holden, the bending reed, is willing to stand firm, that perhaps he can bend. Yeah. And then Jeff says he realizes in that moment he has been myopic and that he and his men have been used. Yeah. Yeah, it's all very true. KBA, to answer your question, I think, don't quote me on this, it's been a while, I'm pretty sure there's a really good documentary about the real bridge on the Blu-ray. I think there's a history documentary on the Blu-ray. I could be wrong about that, but I think there is. So check out the special features listed somewhere online of the Blu-ray and you might see, but there's other History Channel documentaries about this bridge as well, and lots of articles about it. It was harder to find information about the filming of the movie than it was about the real events that inspired them.
Yeah.
So Tony, we've just passed the 2-hour mark. We're at the end of the film. Also, I want to apologize to everybody because I had sworn that I had the bit where he says, "What have I done?" And somehow I think what happened was I had it at the end of the "you" clip. And then I think I decided to try and put it at the beginning of the explosion clip. And I think I dropped it somewhere, which is a huge miss. But guess what? In the grand tradition of dropped clips, I will play that clip at the beginning of the next War Stories. So,
excellent.
Yeah. But yeah. So Tony, you finally seen Bridge on the River Kwai. Where does
seen it twice now?
Yeah. Where does it rank? Was it worth, was all the hype? Did it live up to all the hype? Did it? No holds barred.
Much like with a film like The Hurt Locker,
mm-hmm.
I often don't buy into a lot of this hype. Oscars don't mean anything to me. That's
right.
The Hurt Locker won 6 of them. But a lot of trusted friends had told me, no, this one is deserving of the Best Actor Oscar in the film and directing and all of that. And I would say this exceeded whatever expectations I had because it actually was not what I expected.
Right.
The closing line there by the medical officer, madness. That's the theme of the film. It's about a man's descent into madness and the man's descent into madness and the futility of war.
Yeah.
Look, nobody won in the end.
Right.
Shears dies, Nicholson dies, the bridge is gone. It's all for what? That's what I believe the message, which is why I consider this to be an anti-war film. I don't think this is glamorizing war. These guys are POWs. They're in. I mean, the medical officer, when he delivers that final line, the man, you can see his teeth, and he's not having a fun time on the death railway. So.
No, I don't think anything romanticizes war when the main protagonists are all dead at the end.
Yeah,
because if you're wanting to make war look fun, you don't show people something where the people they're identifying with as the viewer all get slaughtered. I mean, there's no, fun fact. I made sure to pin down this information. That bridge that they blew up was the full-scale bridge that they built for the production, and that train was a real train that they ran off the tracks. It was not a miniature or anything like that. The sad footnote to that is, I don't remember if he was a cameraman. No, he was a stuntman in a Japanese soldier's uniform. He was playing one of the Japanese soldiers on the bridge when it blew up. he was knocked into the water, but he got caught in an undertow and he got pulled downstream. Somebody else jumped in after him to try and save him. They did save him, but then about a month later, back in England, he died in the hospital for tropical diseases because he got some sort of stomach. He got a stomach disease from the water and died. So, which really makes me think about, like, how did they set it up to get William Holden in that water and stuff? Like, did they just, was it just bad luck? You know, because they usually try to make sure that, you know, people are protected from, you know, all that kind of stuff. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it's because, you know, if he got knocked into the water and pulled into an undertow, perhaps he swallowed some of the water.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And William Holden didn't. So yeah.
But yeah, so now we have to ask ourselves the big, always important question at the end of War Stories: where do we go from here?
The next one, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I do have a film in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to announce it here because
I'm game for whatever.
I would like everyone in the audience to try and seek out this film and watch it. It's a little known film from not too long ago. This episode is going to be quite the challenge for me because the film, when it was first released, was called Kajaki, named after the Kajaki hydroelectric dam in Helmand Province, Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the film has been renamed to Kilo 2 Bravo or something like that. I'll post a link on my social media. It's about the British Parachute Regiment up on this hill, monitoring this hydroelectric dam. It's a 100% true story. And they get caught in an old Russian minefield. I know a number of the real characters who are depicted in that film.
Wow.
Which is why it's going to be a challenge for me.
Mm-hmm.
And to go back to the commenter earlier who was like, you know, all movies, no matter how hard they try, will glamorize war in a way. I challenge you with this film.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll send out a link. There we go. Michael Schaefer says Kajaki, 2014 film, also called Kilo 2 Bravo.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it might be on Netflix.
Okay.
It is a very, very difficult watch.
Okay.
And I think this is going to challenge you, Michael, and the audience. So,
all right. I'm game. So,
okay.
All right. Next up for the next War Stories is Kilo 2 Bravo, aka Kajaki. So, everybody, we will see you on the next War Stories. And thanks everybody for showing up tonight. It was fun. And yeah, I guess we'll see you.
Don't forget, the RetroBlasting live stream is back tomorrow.
Right.
And I am so excited.
The RetroBlasting live stream returns tomorrow at 2. Today at noon, the really, really big Indiana Jones and the Last Hurrah was finally posted with myself, Tony, and Matt from Matt Movie 611. It's the longest toy video that's ever been made in the history of the RetroBlasting library. And I've been saying the word Pantheon a lot tonight. I need to. Anyway, thanks, Brain. But yeah, so you can check out that if you have an interest. It turned out so well, and I can't thank Tony and Matt enough for being a part of it. And then tomorrow, hey, that I wouldn't have done it without you. And then tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time, the Saturday live stream. So we'll see you there. There will be a Patreon after show as always too. So, all right, everyone. We'll see you on the next War Stories. Bye, everyone.
Really good show.
Yeah, this was a good show. Bye.
Bye.